didn't know what.
All right, let's get started. Hi, lovely to see so much chatter on a beautiful Friday afternoon. Before we have Dr. Scott Allard introduce our speaker, I just have one main announcement. Next week is our 75th anniversary. A million times. And if you are a student and you have not signed up to present a poster on Thursday night, we have 6 posters. We would like 10, so there's at least 4 more spots. We have upped the stakes. Yes. There are now 3 prizes. First place is 100, second place is 50, third place is 25. In addition, presenters will get a free drink ticket. And the thing that really should be the biggest draw for all of you is that our esteemed alumni and faculty affiliates and external research affiliates will be here. And this will be really good exposure for them to see your work, to know what kind of research you are, and to put a face to a name for your inevitable job market. Yes, so please respond to Jill's email, students, if you have not yet, and you have any poster. We're not asking you to make a new one. We'll print any old thing you have. Not any old thing, but something relatively recent. But without further ado, I will hand it over to.
Oh, I was just going to add one more
announcement from Rowan.
Yeah, just a quick announcement that we are also hosting a refugee workshop for the day. So after this presentation, we'll have light refreshments for lunch, and then Professor Diabdo is here to talk about a project of turning campuses into resettlement spaces. And it's a project that she directs that has been adopted in 19 different chapters around the country and has resettled 500 people. And so my hope is that we end up building that here at the University of Washington. So if you're interested in that project and you're interested in refugee resettlement and specifically trying to build that and creating UW as a welcoming space for refugees, please stay afterwards, join us for some refreshments and for Professor Otto's presentation. Thank you. And now we give you.
Yes, hey. Welcome on a sunny, awesome spring day here in Seattle. A day that reminds me of when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan some time ago. And a new faculty joined the community there in political science, where I was a PhD student. And there's buzz every time this person came into the room. And every time they asked a question, it was really insightful. And then there was an announcement that, oh, there'll be a seminar. And this person will be teaching. And everybody wanted to take it. And it was a packed class. It was one of the most generative, exciting, innovative kind of seminars that I had at that point. It inspired kind of a lot of what I went on to do and inspired a lot of who I came to be as a scholar. And then I was lucky enough to have this person be on my dissertation. The support, the intellectual support, the rigor, and the kind of commitment to social justice that was present in my conversations really shaped that work, but also, again, kind of who I became. So it's a real honor for me today to introduce you to Ann Lin, who is this person I'm referring to, faculty at the University of Michigan's Ford School now, and the Lieberthal-Rogel Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. So I think we found our right homes. We kind of started in political science, and now we're where we belong the whole time in public policy programs. Her expertise, as you know, relates to many pressing issues today. In the talk, you'll get a sense of her work on immigration policy, but she's widely known for her work on policy implementation, criminal justice systems, and social policy. Throughout her career, throughout her teaching, her writing, her work interrogates racial and ethnic differences within policy design and policy implementation. What you'll hear today, maybe for the first time anywhere, I mean, this is kind of like you are here for the moment, is Let States Choose Immigrants, an ambitious project and hopefully an emerging book manuscript, which argues that rather than ceding regulation of the federal government or employers, we should rethink the role that states should play in this process. With that, please join me in welcoming Ann Lin to our room today.
It's really terrifying to get an introduction like that, because when you do, I mean, not only do you have to live up to it, you just wonder how much money the bill that Scott, sends me is going to be. I'm going to pull notes up. Hey. All right, as Scott said, this is the first time I'm doing this talk and introducing this project. I don't know if that is a good thing, you're getting the first view, or a bad thing, it's half-baked and you're going to help me bake it some more. But either way, I'm really grateful for the opportunity, thanks especially to Rawan, who reached out and invited me to come here last spring. And then when I said, I don't want to present research I've already done, let me present something that I'm thinking about, she said, sure, please come do that. Okay, so if I were to ask you who had the most impact on last year's presidential election, excluding the candidates themselves, who would you say? Well, if you ask me, I would say Texas Governor Greg Abbott. Between 2022 and 2024, Abbott bused over 102,000 migrants, people who were released from federal custody after they entered the US without a visa, primarily by applying for asylum at the border. These people came through Texas, so they went to one of the Texas points of entry, or they were apprehended somewhere within Texas, within 100 miles of the border. And they were given permission to be in the US. So they don't have legal status, but they are not, quote unquote, illegal. Their presence is not unauthorized. Of course, this kind of entry to the US happens all of the time in states other, of course, than Texas. What Greg Abbott did, which was distinctive, is that he started putting people on buses. He didn't ask them where they wanted to go. He didn't ask them where they might have relatives or friends or jobs that could support them. He just randomly put them on buses and sent those buses out. And he sent those buses to Democratic cities, Chicago, Denver, New York, Washington, D.C. And his rationale was that he wanted to open Democrats' eyes to the burden that migrants placed on border states like his. Now, other governors soon followed. Republican Ron DeSantis of Florida famously sent a plane load of migrants to Martha's Vineyard because he said he wanted to show those Democratic donors and the vice president of the United States what the kind of havoc that they were wreaking on Texas. But it wasn't just Democratic governors who did this. Katie Hobbs of Arizona also developed her own busing program. So I think it's pretty clear that the, quote, border crisis, unquote, became real to a lot of voters because they weren't just seeing pictures of those migrants crossing the Rio Grande, half drowning in the river, but that instead they were seeing them in their cities. And maybe to top that off, when they got to those cities, because many of these democratic cities had shelter laws, the migrants were then put up in hotels or other kinds of homeless shelters. And the contrast for other immigrants, the contrast for undocumented immigrants, it was pretty clear that this, again, however we think of the underlying policy, it looked like this group of people who just got here were sort of getting a lot of support. So obviously Abbott's actions were partisan and malicious, right? But his essential argument isn't wrong. One of the characteristics of America's legal immigration system is that migrants who enter with sponsorship and or with a specific location, a purpose for coming to the US, have a specific location that they're going to. And in that location, whether that sponsorship is because they're going to a university and are self-funding, or they have a job or a scholarship, or they have family who are supporting them, there is a place that people go to. When people come over the border, however, for the most part, there has not been any sort of national or even regional program that sort of gives people a place to be while they are waiting for asylum applications to be considered, or whether they are whether they are hoping to join family that is already in the United States. And so that puts an extraordinary burden for emergency services and transportation often on border states. And the point that I want to make here is, if it is a federal policy that there are ways of receiving people at the border who may or may not, often will not in the end, get legal status to be in the United States. But if there's a policy of receiving them to the United States, then the border states should not have the sole responsibility, simply because of their location, of taking care of these migrants, right? There should be some type of federal policy to do that. And that kind of federal policy generally has not existed. So what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about immigration and the ways in which our current immigration system is really failing an important constituency in the US, and that is states and state governments. Immigration, I will argue, has a large number of benefits. These are benefits for the country and for the states in which immigrants settle, but those benefits are differentiated over time. Instead, I argue, in order to take our federal system seriously and to address some of the political problems that we have had in trying to create quote unquote comprehensive immigration reform, we should consider a more revolutionary reform, bringing states back into devolving much of migration policy to the states. And so what I'm going to do today, this is a project that has a lot of moving parts, but I'm going to focus on two aspects of the project in particular, why I think this would make a difference for refugees, for refugee policy, and why I think it would make a difference for our policies around undocumented immigrants. And then I will be happy to answer all of your questions or some of your questions about how sort of the other pieces might fit together as well. All right. So in another audience, in an audience that wasn't primarily composed of social scientists, and many of whom know a lot about migration, I would spend a lot of time on this next slide. And instead, I am going to race through it because I think that most of you probably already know these things. So immigrants are a net benefit to the US economy. Most studies have shown that although if you look at lifetime taxes, lifetime earnings, immigrants increase America's GDP and also provide more in taxes than they might spend in costs. One of the reasons that is true is because immigrants almost always act as complements rather than substitutes for American workers. And so in other words, because of the skills and interests and the jobs that immigrants end up getting, those jobs end up growing the economy and creating jobs for non-immigrants, for natives as well. Immigrants also have higher work participation and lower crime rates than native-born Americans. They help to counteract population decline in the United States, both through their own presence, but also their higher fertility rate. They are more likely to have children and more likely to have more children than native-born Americans. And their children, raised that second generation, overwhelmingly speak English and are integrated into the US society and the economy. One of your colleagues here, Jake Victor, has done, among other people, has done some really nice work, sort of comparing integration of immigrants into the United States versus Canada and Northern European countries. And that work shows that immigrants in the United States are really, whether we want to use the term assimilated or not, they are well adapted to the economy and to the society. So, all right. Because we know those facts, it is easy to forget, though, that immigrants don't just come to the United States. They also, of course, come to specific states. And so one of the things that the stylized facts, the results of multiple studies that I relied on for the previous slide suggest is that what these stylized facts elide is that though immigrants are absolutely a benefit to the country as a whole, our federal system means that when immigrants come, they are often a cost, and that cost overwhelmingly is to state and local budgets rather than to the federal budget. Why is this? Well, as I think everybody in this room will know, K-12 education is, I think, the most obvious one. Immigrants' children come to schools. Those schools often require assistance in creating more English as a second language classes or bilingual classes. And of course, K-12 education in the United States is a school district, a local responsibility, and secondarily, a responsibility of the state. Very little funding comes from the federal government. In addition, new immigrants will often increase the use of public goods. Not surprising. You have more people, whether they're from another country or they're moving from another state, they're going to use your roads, they're going to use your parks. And you will often see, especially at the local level, really strong opposition to new immigrant settlement because the use of public goods is a very visible one. You can see more people on the road. You can see more traffic jams. You can see more people in the park or using parks differently. Two other issues, of course, uninsured medical care. So immigrants generally have a pretty low take-up of medical services, because they're uninsured, they primarily get medical services through emergency rooms or through health clinics that allow immigrants to be treated. So of course that is an extra expense, an extra burden. And then finally, housing. More people, obviously more demand means less supply. But you will often, in addition, not only see, sort of demands on the physical housing stock, but sort of ancillary costs where immigrants will double and triple up into housing, which means that their cars are now parked on the street. They're, crowding the neighborhood of parking spaces. That might sound little to you, but that is the kind of issue that often causes a lot of rejection and anger in immigrant receiving communities. Okay. National Academy of Sciences, this report from 2016 looked at a variety of did a variety of studies on immigration. A lot of the sort of facts I talked about on the second slide are from this study. When they look at the fiscal consequences of immigration, however, they determined that first generation immigrants are generally a net cost to states over a lifetime, whereas second and third generation immigrants are a net benefit. because you can't get second or third generation immigrants unless you have the first generation, immigrants come out to be a net benefit. But it's important to understand that there is this sort of shift in costs. I think the other thing it's important to understand, and here I've just given you a couple of examples, is that what those costs are by state are really different. And it's basically not because of the immigrants and what they bring, it's because of the states and what they provide, right? And so this is actually an old number, 2050 for California. Now I think the number would probably be larger, and that's because California became the only state in the US to bring undocumented immigrants into their Medicaid program. So that's a choice that California makes that obviously 49 other states did not make, obviously adds to the fiscal cost of new immigrants. Florida, on the other hand, 2016, and I think these numbers are 2010 numbers, is the cost of only $350, even though California and Florida have similarly large populations of first-generation immigrants. And then Arizona, Washington, I thought I would include Washington, so you can see that your state is a very generous state when it comes to provisions that immigrants benefit from. Michigan, my state, does not turn out to be such a generous state. On average, in the US, they calculated that first-generation immigrants are a net cost of about $1,600. Okay. So what I hope that, so what I would like to propose, therefore, that as states are the entities, the government entities that are bearing much of the cost of new immigration, even though, I hasten to add, over time, they gain from having immigrants. But since states basically have so much skin in the game, we should consider allowing states to be the primary receptors, the primary selectors of immigrants. Immigration is one tool among many for economic development. But you can choose to have an economic development policy that is dependent upon types of immigrant labor, whether that's immigrant labor in the tech industry or immigrant labor in agriculture. You can also choose to have economic development that is less dependent on immigrant labor and perhaps less dependent on labor itself. For instance, moving towards forms of agriculture that you can use automation to replace human labor. States should be able to make those decisions. And I argue that if states were able to make those decisions, you would have more responsible and more substantive debates about immigration at the state level than we are currently able to have at the national level. In addition, immigration builds, diversifies, and strengthens communities. Families, local organizations, and even friendship groups should be given the opportunity to sponsor immigrants. One fact that I can talk a lot more about, but I'm going to just mention briefly for the purposes of this presentation, is when you look at the American immigration system and you look at the legal granting of green cards. Very rough, the US brings until, up until last year, brings in about 1 million to 1.1 million immigrants a year. Half of those immigrants are immigrants that come in over the established immigration quota. They are spouses, minor children, and parents of American citizens. Now, At the individual level, this sounds, reasonable, and I hope, and I think it is absolutely reasonable and defensible. People, of course, should be able to marry and bring their spouse to live with them, should be able to bring their minor children to live with them, should be able to care for their parents. But I think it is astonishing that half of the nation's effective immigration per year, immigration here again, meaning people who have permanent residence, who come with green cards, come in essentially through family sponsorship of a very narrow sort. And so one way to think about this is that if you are a citizen that has close relatives, nuclear family relatives in another country, you have a lot more ability to bring migrants to the US than everybody else. Now, again, like I have said, I don't think that's unreasonable. But on the other hand, other Americans may also have interests in bringing immigrants. They may be friends, they may be coworkers, they may be refugees from the ethnic group or the country of origin that the person has a historical connection to, or perhaps not a historical connection, but a connection that is built from working abroad or living abroad. Right? And so if we're going to take sponsorship seriously as a way of bringing immigrants to the US, I think it's reasonable to consider opening up sponsorship categories. And I'll talk a little bit about how, in fact, we have already experimented with that. Again, I think this kind of sponsorship works better at the state level, with the state making decisions, than it does at a national level. All right. So what I propose, and I will talk about this very quickly, is two tracks. One, an economic sponsorship track that would provide state-specific work permits for employment, which are matched to skills or matched to employers or matched to both. That is, a state could decide, we're going to give out 10,000 permits for doctors or nurses or healthcare workers. A state could also say, hospitals in the state, if you hire people from other countries to be your doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, you come to us with the people you want to hire, and we will give you the visa to do that. So it would not necessarily, my sort of version of this, it does not necessarily need to be employer tied. The employer tie is a decision that states can make about how they want to bring in how they want to bring in new immigrants. Under this scheme, relocation across state borders would require a transfer of the work permit, would require another state to approve the work permit. After a specific interval, however, immigrants would be able to apply to the United States, to the country, for a provisional residence permit that did not include geographical restrictions. I'm purposely leaving like the amount of time open here because I have my preferences, and I'm sure members of Congress do as well. And our preferences probably are not the same. But the sort of path that I propose here is that a provisional residence category, which we do not currently have in the US, would then lead to permanent residence and then lead to citizenship. At the same time, there would also be a community sponsorship track. In this track, families and community groups could sponsor immigrants. Sponsorship will require a financial commitment. That is, the sponsor, just like family sponsors now, and as I'll discuss in a minute, refugee sponsors would have to show that they could provide support for the migrant for a specific period. These migrants would come in with a work permit that would allow them to work, but unlike the employment track, they would not be required to work. And then again, after a specific interval, they would be able to transform this community sponsorship permit into provisional residence, permanent residence, and then citizenship. My expectation is that if you receive the provisional residence permit, it would also be contingent on economic resources or employment. All right, so this approach to state-based immigration, I argue, would offer a path to legalization for undocumented immigrants and a solution for unauthorized migration. It would create a solution for migrants who do, and it would also create a solution for migrants who do not fit the definition of refugee under our current international law. And it would do this, I think, I hope, by reconfiguring the politics of immigration, which, as all of you know, has pretty much been stalled in the United States since 2000. Given our time today, and given the fact that the host today includes this really fantastic conference on forced migration and refugees, what I'm going to do is talk first about refugees, then about undocumented immigrants. I want to emphasize that I see this plan as mostly substituting for our current, the United States' current system of both temporary and permanent migration. That is, we would move what are currently H-1B visas, H-2A visas, these temporary visas. We would move J-1 visas, student visas, when student visas transform into blanking on the title, sorry, the post-educational, thank you, OPT, that OPT could then also be covered under the state-based system. And I would also argue that the way that we currently grant green cards for family sponsorship or for employment sponsorship could also be folded into the system. And obviously there's an awful lot to talk about there, and I'm just sort of putting you on notice. I'm going to duck those questions because I want to talk about refugees and undocumented. Okay. All right, let's talk about refugees. Those of you who are in the room this morning already know that Roland gave a fantastic presentation that really oriented us to the fact that the number of displaced people whom we commonly call refugees in parlance in the world is vast, and the group that actually is understood under international law to be refugees is also vast, but a much smaller percentage of that. So UNHCR now says that someone who's been forced to flee their country, so across country borders, forced to flee their country because of persecution, war, or violence, counts for them as a refugee. These are people that they believe they have a mandate to work with. Let me give you an example of what that number is. UN last year calculated 117 million people in the world as forcibly displaced. So displaced for their homes, some of whom stayed within their country but were displaced, some of whom crossed borders. Of those, 31.6 million are refugees under the UN's mandate. Now, what does that mean? 1951 Refugee Convention says that a refugee is somebody who leaves their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, religion, national origin, social group, or political opinion. What does this include? Obviously, somebody who has who tried to speak up against dictatorship in Syria and was persecuted for it, that person is a refugee. But how about somebody who fled from Syria because their city was being bombed? You are not persecuted by bombs, although you can be just as dead And so that person is not a refugee. How about somebody who's fleeing an earthquake? You can die just as well from an earthquake, but you are not a refugee under the UN's codification of understanding of international law. What that means is that people who have been coming to the United States from Central America, claiming asylum at the border and are now in the United States to have their asylum cases considered, are overwhelmingly not eventually going to get asylum. And that is because although they are fleeing famine in their countries that they've come from, climate change induced disaster in the countries that they come from, corruption, police forces that either because they are corrupt or because they are incapable are not able of preventing gangs from terrorizing residents, or because they are fleeing, or even if they are fleeing domestic violence in their homeland. They are overwhelmingly, under the US's current standards and other most countries' current standards, not going to get a refugee determination. Hold that thought in your moment and let me talk a second about refugee resettlement. UNHCR vets refugees. Remember, they've already gone from 117 million down to 36. Of those 36 million, many are not asking to be resettled in a third country, but many are. They vet those refugees applying for resettlement. After they have vetted those refugees, the State Department, or similarly, the State Departments of other countries, consider whether those refugees fit their nation's definition of a refugee and whether their country should accept that person. And if they do, in the US, you then get allocated to a resettlement agency, and that resettlement agency manages your community placement, your placement in a particular place in the United States, and your support for your financial support for the first 6 months, and the support that you need to resettle after that. That's 60,000 people in the United States last year, which is a lot. In the United States, we also have 860,000 people who are currently under something called temporary protected status or deferred enforced departure. These are people from a variety of countries who at one time the State Department determined that they were coming from countries where emergencies made it difficult for them to return to their country. Temporary protected status and deferred enforced departure are notable because they don't give refuge to anybody who is coming to the US. They only give refuge to people who are already in the US at the time the decree is made. And so basically what they're doing is preventing undocumented immigrants, people on tourist visas, people on business visas from having to go back to the country of origin during the time that TPS is established. But in reality, what I think you should look at this like is a refugee program for people who are already in the US but don't qualify as refugees. They are fleeing for all the same reasons that the 117 million people across the world are fleeing. They just got to the US, and now we're allowing them to stay until we decide that they can't stay anymore. In addition, we have currently 945,000 open asylum cases in the United States. And to give you an example of scale, 54,000 of those asylum cases were accepted, were processed, given a favorable determination so that those people could stay in the US. 54,000 accepted asylum seekers is almost the same number as the number of refugees, of course, who were accepted. 945,000 asylum seekers doubles the number of people who are in the US under temporary protected status and DED. The other thing that I want to say about asylum seekers is that this number is really unusual in US history. It's unusual because the Biden administration made a decision that people who were coming to the border to ask for asylum and people who applied to the US for asylum from their home country. So they didn't show up here, but they were in Honduras or in Colombia, and they could apply and given the ability to apply for asylum in the US, that all of those people would be accepted into the asylum system. And so prior to 2021, in 2021, the caseload was 73,000 asylum applications, which again is an awful lot, again, is more than the number of refugees that we accepted, last year, but is a number on a completely different scale. What I want to argue here is the fact that there is this demand for and need for sponsorship to stay in the United States means that the UN definition of which the US has accepted as part of international law is not sufficient as a rationale for addressing the number of people either that the US currently shelters or that the US might wish to shelter. And so in the last 10 years, there have been a number of changes sort of around the edges of refugee and asylee policy that basically expand the ways in which that progression towards resettlement in the US works. And to summarize these very quickly, all of them basically allow family members, people who form their own groups, 5 people or more who form their own groups to provide financial sustenance for refugees, or community groups, churches, unions, ethnic origin groups, etc., to be able to sponsor refugees to come to the United States. And I'm not going to say anything more about this because the presentation after mine, Dia Abdo's presentation, is going to talk a lot about one of these programs, Every Campus a Refuge. And I want to suggest that this kind of innovation in our refugee system is something that we should be able to build into our sponsorship system for immigration. And because it is so community oriented, it is, I argue, a process that is better governed by states than it would be by the federal government. How then would you end up being able to determine who comes to the United States? And I would argue here that states should be able instead, to determine and set their own numerical limits. Again, they can think about how they want to do that, whether they want to do it by category or by an overall number. But I think the big difference here is that it moves us away from the focus and the prioritizing of a particular type of relationship, the nuclear family relationship that has previously governed our understanding of sponsorship in the United States. Okay, it is 1:15 and I really want to leave you time for questions. So what I want to do here is very quickly just say 2 things about legalization. Okay. Happy to talk to you about why our legalization, the only large-scale legalization program we've had in the US, 1986, did not work, but I'm going to skip over most of this. What I'm going to tell you from here, this is the amount we have spent on border enforcement from 2003 until 2023. Blue is Customs and Border Protection, green is ICE, and what you see is an explosion of spending on border enforcement that, for the most part, has not been able to prevent unauthorized migrants from coming to the United States, and in fact may have backfired and actually kept undocumented migrants in the US, because the harder it is for people to leave and then return, the more they feel like they need to stay, because once they leave, they may never be able to get back. One of the things that this creates is an undocumented population who has been in the US for an extraordinary amount of time. A third of the undocumented population has been in the US for over 15 years. So these are people who have settled, found jobs, built families, bought houses. You know, they are people who are already fully integrated into American life. But because they are undocumented and we have no path to citizenship, there is very few avenues for them to convert themselves into legal migrants. I'm also going to skip over this, although it is a really, I think, important and interesting story about why this system that we created in 1986, which had legalization of people currently in the US, border enforcement, and then employer sanctions as its sort of third leg, its third approach to controlling undocumented migration. Employer sanctions have been largely absent from our immigration system, and I can talk a lot about why that is true. But what that comes down to is the last point that I make on this slide, which is that one of the reasons employers who want to hire legal immigrants can only, because of where they are, because of the employment situation in their states, can only hire undocumented immigrants. They need the ability to sponsor their workers in the same way that people who, you know, can sponsor, who in the same way that our current employment sponsorship system allows employers to sponsor immigrants. This this policy tool needs to be expanded to employers of undocumented immigrants as well. And so when we're in, excuse me, so if then you're thinking about how employers ought to be able to sponsor people who are already working for them, as well as future immigrants, again, what I would argue is that states are best placed to evaluate those employers and their needs. As Scott said, I was trained as a political scientist, and in the end, what I have not had a lot of time to talk to you about, but what I think is really important, is that the problem with comprehensive immigration reform is a political problem. It's a political problem because if you look at the debates of over the last 20 years, what you see is an erosion of state participation in those debates, along with an erosion of peak associations like the Chamber of Congress or the AFL-CIO or the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. You have seen an erosion of space for participation in the immigration debate from states, from peak associations, towards what we all know is a polarized partisan politics. And that polarized partisan politics doesn't engage with any of the very real economic costs or economic benefits of immigration. It doesn't engage with the kinds of economic needs that employers have, and it doesn't engage with families and communities who may have, may not have preferences over how many refugees the US should bring in, but have very specific preferences over people that they would like to be able to sponsor for resettlement. And so in order to break apart that politics, you need to create a way for new actors and new alliances to come into the debate. And so what I'm arguing for as a state-based approach is as much an argument for creating a new politics of immigration as it is creating a set of new immigration policies, right? And so what I hope that such an approach would allow is what you might consider both support, not only support for immigration, which I have, of course, really been focused on in this presentation, but also responsible opposition to immigration, an opposition to immigration that can win an argument about employer needs, can win an argument about state economies, or can win an argument about burdens, fiscal burdens placed on schools or public goods or housing, as opposed to the kind of argument that we have now, which, as many of the presentations we saw this morning allude to, are really about the humanitarian stories we use to defend certain immigrants or the dehumanization of immigrants in return. Thanks for your attention, and I'm very happy to entertain questions. All right, so I did not leave 15 minutes. I've left about 5. Yeah, please.
What is your vision? The last decision that asked counties, not states, accept that they wanted to pay for themselves. So there was a move to put it in the hands of counties, cities, states. But it was difficult because even there was no
How do you do that? Right.
So who's having the conversations to make this decision?
My expectation is that state legislatures would be making these decisions. That just as we have a national immigration framework that Congress creates and that an executive branch implements, that something similar would happen in the states. And I think you're absolutely right to bring it up, that to the extent that these are decisions that maybe should be made at a county level or even a lower level than the state, that similarly county boards, elected township supervisors, city governments, etc., would be able to make those decisions, and then obviously liaise with the right level of state government and with the right level of federal government. I should have acknowledged this at the beginning, and I would just say this now, that one of the real inspiration for this project is a very similar provincial selection policy that Canada has. And one of the things I think you see in Canadian policy is that although there are, ebbs and flows of pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant sentiment, that the debate is very different, because in addition to a national discussion, there are important provincial discussions, which, even when provinces are anti-migrant, they are also pro-migrant in particular ways or for particular areas, right? And so part of the issue here is just how do you increase the number of political venues where you can make a set of immigration decisions and increase the incentives of actors to think about the real benefits and costs of migration rather than the sort of polarized rhetoric around migration. Yes, Jacob.
It's an interesting proposal. I like it, but it requires an economics.
Yes.
So what's your pitch to say Republican Senator Biden? Basically, I don't see the Senate changing hands anytime soon.
Yeah.
So to get this done, we need not all of that, that's all.
Yeah, but some of
So what's your pitch?
the pitch is to governors, frankly. I mean, this is sort of my approach to thinking about where this goes is a book manuscript, which I am completing, but really what it is a pitch to my governor, Governor Whitmer, who may be considering running for president, Governor Pritzker, who may be considering running for president, but as you're pointing out, and I think it's absolutely right, Republican governors as well, that this area is an area that matters to their states, but that they have been unable to have influence over. And I'll tell you the model very quickly, it's welfare reform. That when we devolved, and Scott knows better than many other people, all the problems that, have attended on the devolution of welfare reform, but the politics of welfare reform really changed when governors began to assert and have policy ways that allowed them to assert, through waivers, etc., their political interest in welfare.
So I didn't hear a pitch for Republican senators there, and without a governors can say whatever they want, they can't do anything. So am I to interpret your comment as saying, let's give Republican governors and senators the leeway to refuse what are now legal immigrants?
I would say.
So say there will be no H-1B recipients in Idaho or something like that.
I am willing to make the bet that if Idaho said, Montana said, no more H-1B recipients, we don't want those people here, that they would hear it from the employers of H-1B immigrants in their states. If the governor of Idaho heard, said, let's, I am going to use every verification method possible to make sure that undocumented immigrants don't work in my state, and that definitely takes an act of Congress, that farmers are going to say, or loggers, foresters in Idaho are going to say, you can't do that to us. Right now, they can say, you can't do this to us, and the governor can't do anything about it, so he's free to reject it. And the hope is that when that's not possible, that then you can move towards, Ron.
Thank you for that presentation. I almost raised my hand without thinking, sorry to last 60 seconds. I suppose I just wanted to build on what we're already saying. So one pushback would be the employers, and another way to conceptualize that is saying that the rights of citizens would be negatively affected, or their ability to seek prosperity. And this group, the employers, they do have, they're a strong enough group to be able to push against. But what about the citizens that don't have that kind of collective? So I'm thinking, because people are not just either immigrants or either citizens, we're all connected. So what happens to I'm thinking Jane Lopez's work, we're around mixed status families. What happens when governance reaches the subnational level is restricted? Maybe some citizens' rights would allow for the advocating for immigrants' rights, but other citizens' rights are not strong enough as a collective, let's say, to advocate in that way. I'm just curious how that might.
I think that's absolutely right. But I would argue that those citizens are, if they're not strong enough at the local level, they're not going to be strong enough at the national level. I mean, and so does this mean that, some people are going to have, more ability to bring in migrants than other people? Yeah, absolutely. It does not solve the problem of powerlessness, but one of the sort of distortion in immigration policy currently is that even people who should have power are not able to move, migration through the Congress.
I could just follow to say that, I commend you on trying to tackle this. I'm reminded of how, the 1951 Refugee Convention, there's just been, even refugee advocates are unwilling to open it up for fear that it'll become more restrictionist. So I think that there's this history of how reforming or moving towards a more justice-oriented frame has actually faced challenges because of the fear of opening it up. And so I recognize that in your proposal to open it up, it gets thinking about worst case scenarios as well. And I think that that's really, it's realistic. Like, we're thinking about all these things together. And so I appreciate the chance to think about that tension.
Thank you. I mean, I would just say, to just add to what you're saying, there is almost nobody, who, if you talk to about refugees, even if they, have seen the 1951 convention, understand persecution, does not, uses the word refugee to distinguish between people who are fear of persecution and people who don't, right? I mean, I acknowledge and understand and have been part of some of these debates about whether or not you can open up the refugee convention and the fear of basically losing the convention completely if you open it up. But it's not clear to me either in practice, or in theory, that as we being the United States, is not currently accepting refugees, big definition, based on this refugee convention, that we have more people here through TPS and DED, right, than we do refugees, that we aren't already, in some ways, we aren't already doing this already. We aren't already admitting people beyond the conventions. We're just not doing it in any systematic or, frankly, fair way.
So there's a lot of conversation to continue to occur throughout the day, and we'll be here as the events and the next speaker continue. But join me in thanking Anne for a wonderful